Philip Larkin was one of the most important British poets of the mid 20th century, and I want to hang out with a poem of his today that's been on my mind lately. So, Larkin was born in the 20s. He was a college student during World War II, and he served most of his adult life in his career as a librarian at various university libraries. He went to Oxford, and he came of age in a poetical climate which was on the tail end of modernism. T.S. Eliot, W.B. Yeats, Auden, these writers had rose to fame and influence, but there was kind of a question of what British poetry was going to be in the mid to late 20th century. And Larkin answered this with an interesting amalgamation of poetry that was very colloquial, that talked about mid 20th century consumerism and suburban life, but also married it to a subtle traditional structure of rhyme and meter. I want to look at this in Larkin's poem of the mid 1950s called Church Going.
Once I am sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. Another church, matting, seats and stone and little books, sprawlings of flowers, cut for Sunday, brownish now, some brass and stuff up at the holy end, the small neat organ, and a tense, musty, unignorable silence, brewed God knows how long. Hatless, I take off my cycle clips in awkward reverence, move forward, run my hand around the font. From where I stand, the roof looks almost new. Cleaned or restored? Someone would know, I don't. Mounting the lectern, I peruse a few hectoring large-scale verses and pronounce, "Here endeth," much more loudly than I'd meant. The echoes snigger briefly. Back at the door, I sign the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. Yet stop I did. In fact, I often do, and always end much at a loss like this, wondering what to look for, wondering, too, when churches fall completely out of use, what we shall turn them into, if we shall keep a few cathedrals chronically on show, their parchment, plate, and pyx in locked cases, and let the rest rent free to rain and sheep. Shall we avoid them as unlucky places, or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one? Power of some sort or other will go on in games and riddles, seemingly at random, but superstition like belief must die, and what remains when disbelief has gone? Grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky, a shape less recognizable each week, a purpose more obscure. I wonder who will be the last, the very last, to seek this place for what it was, one of the crew that tap and jot and know what rude lofts were, some ruined bibber randy for antique or Christmas addict, counting on a whiff of gown and bands and organ pipes and myrrh. Or will he be my representative? Bored, uninformed, knowing the ghostly silt dispersed, yet tending to this cross of ground through suburb scrub, because it held unspilt so long and equably what since is found only in separation, marriage and birth and death, and thoughts of these, for which was built this special shell. For though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth, it pleases me to stand in silence here. A serious house, on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet, are recognized and robed as destinies. And that much never can be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious, and gravitating with it to this ground, which he once heard was proper
to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round.
So let's talk a little bit about what's going on in this poem. It's a poem of 7 stanzas, and formally speaking, there's 9 lines of iambic pentameter per stanza, and there's a rhyme scheme. It's not easy to pick up on in the first time or two that I read this poem. I didn't pay attention to the rhyme scheme, but it's there. If you look at the first stanza, we have the lines ending with on, shut, stone, cut, stuff, organ, silence, off, reverence. It's interesting. The opening line is a statement that kind of just in a very Larkin-esque style feels kind of a throwaway. Once I'm sure there's nothing going on, I step inside, letting the door thud shut. It's very colloquial. At first, I think we read it as okay, he's walking into a church. It's called church going. He needs to make sure there's nothing going on. And there's no services or prayer meetings or anything. But I think that given that the poem ends up meditating on the death of religious belief and even of superstition itself, I think we could read that line on second read maybe as a statement of metaphysics. Once I am sure there's nothing going on, once I am sure that there's nothing going on, not just in the church, but kind of upstairs, that ultimately the answer is nothing, or there is no answer to the eternal questions of life, especially eternal religious questions. And I actually really like reading this poem with this as an opening statement because it becomes a meditation on religion after religion. Now, I'm a religious person myself. I love highfalutin religious theological poetry, as you know if you watch this channel. But I think it's very interesting to see Larkin, someone who was, avowedly not religious. He calls himself bored and uninformed when it comes to religion later in the poem. I like that he's saying, okay, but let's do this poetic exercise where we go into a church and think about it. And given that the poem ends on a very, I think, positive note, when it comes to the wisdom and gravity and seriousness of religion, it's kind of a bold project. Now, this poem has been criticized for being overly colloquial, and Larkin ran into this a lot, that, you're kind of just speaking the language of the common man, kind of the mid-20th century consumerist, suburban voice. And I think that Larkin would have said, yes, that's precisely what I'm doing. But Larkin infuses this voice all throughout this poem and other poems with a sort of melancholy and this reflexive self-criticism. This isn't a, yay, I'm bored and uninformed, long live the bored and uninformed. Ultimately, he wants us to ask questions about the nature of man, the nature of society, and the nature of belief. So the first couple stanzas are just him walking around the church. He talks about taking his cycle clips off. It's this very awkward, he's not dressed to go to church. He's been cycling around. He's in athletic gear. This is very incongruous. And the end of the second stanza has this, I signed the book, donate an Irish sixpence, reflect the place was not worth stopping for. If it had ended there, we would say, this is just a guy who doesn't really know much about church and goes in and feels a little embarrassed and awkward and leaves and says, well, that was a waste of time. But then Larkin, who's too thoughtful to just do that, in the third stanza, which kind of introduces the middle part of the poem, says, yet stop I did, in fact I often do, and always end much at a loss like this. So he's going to say, no, let's think about this more. My adventure in the church is done, but let's now meditate on the future. And he has these really interesting meditations where he ends up with these statements like superstition like belief must die. He also moves into, I think, a much older register. We have the cycle clips and things like that. But by the end of the middle stanzas, he has this great line that almost feels like Hamlet. Or after dark will dubious women come to make their children touch a particular stone, pick simples for a cancer, or on some advised night see walking a dead one. That feels straight out of Hamlet, Act 1, Scene 1. On the advised night a dead one walks. But that rhymes with stone and go on and gone. And the end of that stanza is grass, weedy pavement, brambles, buttress, sky. Just kind of a list of common things in an aging, maybe post-religious society. Now, it could end pretty dark if it ended with this middle movement. It will all go away and it will just go back to nature. Robinson Jeffers has meditations like this from his California poetry, that man is ultimately going to go extinct, and luckily the animals and plants will take over again and life will be better. But there's a final movement of the poem. Though I've no idea what this accoutred frowsty barn is worth. It's kind of demeaning language. But then it pleases me to stand in silence here. It kind of clicks into a more regular iambic rhythm. A serious house on serious earth it is, in whose blent air all our compulsions meet. You almost want to read it with a sort of sonorous sense. Larkin knows how to say, okay, we're getting serious here. And that much never will be obsolete, since someone will forever be surprising a hunger in himself to be more serious and gravitating with it toward this ground. There's something about church for Larkin that calls the one who inevitably, no matter when he lives in history, decides, I got to get more serious about life. Maybe this is kind of the midlife crisis voice. The like, oh shoot, what's it all about? What's it all for? Even if you think you're pretty sure there's nothing going on, you surprise in yourself a desire for seriousness and wisdom. And then we have this wonderful final scene, gravitating with it toward this ground, which he once heard was proper to grow wise in, if only that so many dead lie round. And he's been thinking about the church and the structures of it. He calls it an accoutred frowsty barn. He says, I don't know what it's worth, as if real estate prices are the most important thing here. But then he pans out and remembers for the first time, at least reminds us for the first time, this is a place next to a cemetery. The old churches of England, especially rural England, this is where you bury the dead. And all of a sudden, the witness of the dead becomes very apparent. And it adds to, I think, this sense of seriousness and wisdom, and that the old lives still witness to what is enduringly human. Thanks for hanging out with Larkin's Church Going, a poem that, like I said before, sometimes has made people mad. Not just religious people, sometimes irreligious people have felt like maybe it takes religion too seriously, or, gives in too much to a certain sort of religious sentimentality. What do you think? I especially like this poem as an example of someone using traditional form in a way that's very subtle and to great effect when it needs to click into a more lofty register. Thanks for hanging out with us and exploring Philip Larkin's Church Going.